When Martha Caldwell pushed open the door of the abandoned trapper's cabin on that frozen February morning, the silence hit her first. Then came the smell, milk, soiled cloth, and something else. Fear, the kind that seeps into wooden walls and refuses to leave. What she found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life, but not in the way she expected. 14 babies, 7 sets of twins, all under 2 years old, all alive. All staring at her with eyes that had seen too much suffering for such tender ages. Someone had left them there to die. But Martha Caldwell wasn't the kind of woman who walked away from impossible situations. She was the kind who walked straight into them, consequences be damned. The question wasn't whether she would save them. The question was, what terrible secret had led someone to abandon 14 children in the wilderness, and whether that someone would come looking for what they'd left behind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Montana Territory, February 1889. The wind howled across the Bitterroot Valley with the kind of cold that could kill a grown man in an hour. Martha Caldwell had lived in Montana long enough to respect that cold, to understand that winter here didn't negotiate. It took what it wanted, livestock, fingers, lives, and left survivors to count their losses come spring. She'd been tracking a wounded elk for 3 miles, following blood spots in the snow that grew fainter with each passing minute. Her husband, Jonathan, had been dead for 2 years now, crushed under a falling tree while clearing land for expansion. Their homestead, 60 acres of stubborn Montana soil, had become her entire world. She hunted because she had to. She survived because giving up wasn't in her vocabulary. The elk's trail led her off the familiar paths, deeper into the pine forests that climbed the western slopes. That's when she saw the cabin. It shouldn't have been there. This was unclaimed land, too remote for even the hardiest trappers. The structure was small, maybe 15 feet square, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney that showed no smoke. Martha's instincts screamed danger. Abandoned buildings in the wilderness usually meant one of 3 things. Someone had died, someone was hiding, or someone had left in a hurry. None of those scenarios invited investigation, but something was wrong with the silence. It felt deliberate, held breath quiet, like the moment before a scream. She approached carefully, her rifle ready, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The cabin's single window was covered from the inside with what looked like torn fabric. The door hung slightly ajar, ice crystals forming along its edges. Martha pushed it open with the barrel of her rifle. The smell hit her immediately, that mixture of human habitation and desperate neglect. Her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and what she saw made her mind refuse to process the information for several long seconds. Babies. Everywhere. They were arranged in makeshift cribs, wooden crates lined with straw and scraps of blankets. 14 of them, some sleeping, some awake and staring at her with wide, solemn eyes. Not one of them was crying. That silence was more terrifying than any amount of wailing would have been. Martha's rifle clattered to the floor. She moved from crate to crate, her hands shaking as she checked each child. They were alive, all of them, though severely malnourished. Their clothes, what little they had, were soaked through. The cabin was barely warmer than the outside air. A small pile of provisions sat in the corner. Half a sack of cornmeal, 3 cans of condensed milk, a jar of water frozen solid. How long had they been here? How were they still alive? Then she noticed the patterns. These weren't 14 random children. They were twins, 7 identical pairs. 2 boys with matching copper-colored hair. 2 girls with distinctive birthmarks on their left shoulders. 2 more boys with the same unusual gray-green eyes. The similarities were unmistakable. Martha had seen many strange things in her 43 years on the frontier, but nothing like this. This wasn't abandonment born of poverty or desperation. This was something else entirely. Something planned. Something cold and calculated. She knelt beside the nearest crate, where a pair of twin girls, maybe 18 months old, watched her with expressions far too serious for their age. One reached out a tiny hand, not pleading, just observing, testing whether this new presence meant salvation or more suffering. "I've got you," Martha whispered, though her mind was already racing with the impossibility of her promise. "I've got all of you." But even as she said it, reality crashed down like an avalanche. 14 babies, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of winter. Her homestead was 3 miles away through deep snow. She had 1 horse, limited supplies, and no help within a day's ride of her property. She couldn't carry them all, not even half of them, and leaving any behind, even for an hour, would be a death sentence in this cold. Martha forced herself to think methodically, the way Jonathan had taught her when facing impossible problems. First, immediate survival. The cabin had a fireplace. There was wood stacked outside, protected under an overhang. She could get a fire going, warm the space, buy herself time to formulate a plan. She worked quickly, gathering wood, coaxing flames from the frozen kindling, using the precious matches she always carried. The fire caught, and slowly, painfully slowly, warmth began to seep into the cabin. The babies watched her with that same eerie silence, as if they'd learned that making noise brought nothing good. As the cabin warmed, Martha began a more thorough inventory. The cornmeal was barely enough for a single proper meal. The condensed milk cans were nearly empty. Someone had been rationing them carefully. In a corner she found a leather journal, its pages water-stained and barely legible. She opened it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was feminine. "Educated, desperate. February 3rd. They found us in Butte. We ran. Margaret says we can't keep running forever. The children slow us down too much. I can't write what we're considering. God forgive us. February 5th, we reached the cabin. Margaret is sick, fever. The children are hungry. We have so little left. The men from the Institute will find us eventually. They always do. February 7th, Margaret died this morning. I buried her behind the cabin in ground, so frozen I could barely make a dent. I'm alone with 14 children who aren't mine, who belong to women who trusted us, who paid us to keep their secrets safe. February 8th, I'm going for help. Leaving supplies. The children will be cold but alive. Better cold and alive than what the Institute will do to them. I'll return before nightfall. I promise them. I promise." The entry ended there. Dated 5 days ago, Martha's hands tightened on the journal. The Institute. She'd heard whispers about it, the kind of stories people told in hushed voices over whiskey in saloons. An organization back east, Boston some said, or Philadelphia, that dealt in the business of unwanted children. But not adoption, something darker, something involving wealthy families who wanted heirs but couldn't have children of their own, and weren't particular about how those children were obtained. Twin trafficking, the thought crystallized in her mind with horrible clarity. Twins were valuable. You could sell one to a family desperate for a child and keep the other as insurance, or sell both to different families and double your profit. Identical twins meant built-in verification of authenticity for buyers who wanted to ensure the child they were purchasing was healthy, legitimate. But something had gone wrong. Someone, the woman who'd written that journal, had tried to save these children, had run from whoever she worked for, had hidden them in this remote cabin and gone for help that never came. Martha looked at the babies again, understanding flooding through her. These children weren't abandoned out of cruelty. They were hidden, protected. Someone had chosen this location precisely because it was so remote, so unlikely to be found, which meant whoever was looking for them wouldn't stop searching. A sound outside made Martha freeze. Not the wind, horses. Multiple horses, their hooves crunching through snow and ice. She moved to the window, peering through a gap in the fabric covering. 3 riders approached through the trees, dressed in heavy coats, their faces wrapped against the cold. They moved with purpose, like men who knew exactly where they were going. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. They'd found the cabin, which meant they'd been searching systematically, probably covering the entire region in a grid pattern. Professional, organized, dangerous. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached the door. 14 babies who couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything but depend on her. And 3 men who would take these children back to whatever fate awaited them. Martha Caldwell had spent 2 years surviving alone in one of the harshest territories in America. She'd learned to shoot, to trap, to track, to read weather patterns and animal behavior. She'd learned that survival often came down to a single moment where you either acted or died. This was that moment. She grabbed her rifle, checked the load, and positioned herself behind the door. Her mind worked frantically. She couldn't fight 3 armed men and protect 14 babies simultaneously, but she could make them hesitate, could buy time, could make them believe she was more dangerous than she appeared. The footsteps reached the door. A man's voice called out, cultured and cold, "We know you're in there. We're from the Berkshire Children's Institute. We're here to retrieve our property. Come out peacefully and no one gets hurt." Property. The word made Martha's blood boil. These weren't property. These were children. Babies who'd been born to mothers, who'd probably been told their twins had died, or been convinced to give them up, or had them stolen in ways Martha could barely imagine. She steadied her rifle and called back, her voice carrying the hard edge of a woman who'd buried her husband and survived 2 Montana winters alone. "This is Martha Caldwell's cabin. You're trespassing on my land. Turn around and ride out, or I'll assume you're claim jumpers and act accordingly." A pause. Then laughter. "Mrs. Caldwell, we have no quarrel with you. We simply want what belongs to the Institute. Open the door, hand over the children, and we'll be on our way." "These children don't belong to anyone," Martha said, her finger moving to the trigger. "Except maybe God, and he put them in my path for a reason." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear them conferring in low voices. Then the same man spoke again, his tone shifting to something harder, more threatening. "Mrs. Caldwell, you don't understand what you're dealing with. The Institute has resources, connections, legal authority. You can't win this fight." "Maybe not," Martha replied, "but I can make it expensive. First man through this door takes a bullet. Second man might get me, but that leaves 14 witnesses and a lot of explaining to do when the territorial marshal shows up. Your choice." The truth was, the nearest marshal was in Helena, 3 days' ride away. But they didn't know that. And Martha had learned that confidence, real or manufactured, could be as powerful as any weapon. She heard them moving, repositioning. They were preparing to rush the door. Martha tightened her grip on the rifle, her mind already calculating angles, wondering if she could actually bring herself to shoot a man, knowing that hesitation would cost these children everything. Then one of the babies, one of the twin boys with copper hair, finally broke the terrible silence. He began to cry, not a wail, but a soft, heartbroken sound that spoke of hunger, cold, and abandonment. And in that moment, Martha Caldwell made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She wasn't going to just save these children today. She was going to build them a life, a home. Something the frontier had stolen from her when it took Jonathan, but something she could create for 14 souls who had no one else. But first, she had to survive the next 5 minutes. The door exploded inward. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The door slammed against the interior wall with a crack that sent splinters flying. Martha fired without hesitation, not at the men, but at the door frame above their heads. The rifle's report was deafening in the confined space, and the bullet tore through wood with a sharp whine that made all 3 men dive for cover. "Next one goes lower," Martha shouted, already working the bolt action to chamber another round. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from countless hours of target practice on her homestead. "I warned you!" The babies erupted into chaos. 14 voices finally finding their terror, crying and wailing in a discordant symphony that filled the cabin. Martha's heart broke at the sound, but she couldn't comfort them. Not yet. Not while 3 men crouched behind whatever cover they'd found outside, deciding whether a bunch of orphaned twins was worth dying for. "You're making a serious mistake, Mrs. Caldwell," the cultured voice called out, strained now with anger. "The Institute has legal documentation for these children. You're interfering with a legitimate recovery operation." "Legal?" Martha barked out a bitter laugh. "Show me your papers, then." Slide them under the door. Let me see these legitimate documents that give you the right to take 14 babies from a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Silence. The kind that confirmed everything she suspected. There were no papers, no legal authority. Just men with guns, and the arrogance that came from working for people powerful enough to operate above the law. Martha's mind raced. She'd bought herself minutes at most. Even if she could hold them off until nightfall, then what? She couldn't stay barricaded in this cabin forever with 14 starving babies. The provisions were nearly gone. The firewood would last perhaps another day if she was conservative. And these men could simply wait her out, or worse, burn the cabin down around her. She needed a miracle, or at least a very good plan. That's when she heard the fourth horse. The sound of hooves approached from a different direction, moving fast through the snow. Martha risked a glance through the gap in the window covering and saw a lone rider emerging from the tree line. A woman, sitting tall in the saddle despite the brutal cold, her dark coat billowing behind her like a war banner. The 3 men from the Institute heard her too. They turned, weapons raised, clearly not expecting company. The woman reined in her horse 20 yards from the cabin, close enough to be heard but far enough to retreat if necessary. She was perhaps 60 years old, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face carved from granite and determination. A rifle rested across her saddle, and the way she held it suggested she knew exactly how to use it. "Benjamin Thatcher," the woman called out, her voice carrying authority that cut through the wind. "Is that you hiding behind that tree like a coward?" One of the men straightened slightly, visible now in Martha's line of sight. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, well-dressed beneath his winter coat. His expression flickered between surprise and something that looked like fear. "Mrs. Brennan," he said carefully, "this is Institute business. It doesn't concern you, doesn't concern me." The woman's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "When you're hunting children like animals in territory I've lived in for 30 years, when you bring your filthy Boston business to Montana and think no one will notice, everything that happens in this valley concerns me, boy." Martha watched, hardly daring to breathe. Who was this woman? An ally? Another threat? The babies continued crying behind her, their voices growing weaker. They were exhausted, running on empty reserves that wouldn't last much longer. Benjamin Thatcher stepped fully into view now, attempting to regain control of the situation. "With respect, Mrs. Brennan, this institute has invested considerable resources in locating these children. They represent significant financial—" "Finish that sentence and I'll shoot you myself," Mrs. Brennan interrupted, and the cold certainty in her voice made clear this wasn't an idle threat. "Those are babies, not livestock. Not property, not investments. And the woman in that cabin," she nodded toward Martha's position, "she's Martha Caldwell. Her husband, Jonathan, helped me build my irrigation system 2 years back. Good man, honest man. His widow's got more integrity in her little finger than your entire organization has in its corrupt soul." Martha felt a surge of recognition. Brennan, Catherine Brennan. She owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, controlled thousands of acres, and wielded influence that extended all the way to the territorial governor. Jonathan had spoken of her with respect. A widow herself, who'd built an empire through sheer force of will after her husband died in a range war. "Mrs. Brennan," Martha called out, making a split-second decision to trust this unexpected intervention. "There are 14 babies in here, twins, all under 2 years old. These men claim they're from some institute back east. They were going to take them." "We're going to," Catherine Brennan repeated, emphasizing the past tense. She shifted in her saddle, and Martha noticed for the first time that she wasn't alone. 3 more riders emerged from the trees behind her, ranch hands from the look of them, all armed, all watching the Institute men with expressions that promised violence if necessary. The odds had shifted dramatically. Benjamin Thatcher's composure cracked. "This is illegal interference with what?" Catherine cut him off. "You have no legal standing here, no authority. Montana Territory doesn't recognize your institute's jurisdiction. And even if it did, you'd need proper documentation filed with the territorial courts. Which you don't have, do you, Benjamin? Because what you're doing isn't legal. It's kidnapping dressed up in expensive suits and bureaucratic language. One of Thatcher's men, a thick-shouldered brute who looked more enforcer than administrator, stepped forward. "We're taking those children. You can't stop us." Catherine's rifle came up in a smooth, practiced motion, aimed directly at the man's chest. "I absolutely can stop you. Question is whether you're stupid enough to make me prove it." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Martha could see the calculation happening in Thatcher's eyes, weighing his options, measuring the cost of violence against the value of his mission. These weren't lawmen or soldiers with a code of duty. These were hired mercenaries who'd run at the first real threat to their lives. Finally, Thatcher raised his hands in a gesture of temporary surrender. "This isn't over, Mrs. Brennan. The Institute has resources you can't imagine. Legal teams, political connections. We'll be back with proper authority. And when you return, I'll have filed custody papers with the territorial court in Helena." Catherine interrupted. "I'll have witnesses sworn and documented. I'll have every newspaper from here to San Francisco writing stories about the Berkshire Children's Institute and its habit of trafficking in stolen babies. You want a war, Benjamin? I've got the ammunition for it. So you go back east and tell your employers that Montana isn't a hunting ground for their sick business." Thatcher's jaw clenched. For a moment, Martha thought he might actually try to force the issue. Then he turned to his men. "Mount up." "We're leaving, but the children," the thick-shouldered man protested. "I said mount up," Thatcher snapped, his cultured veneer cracking to reveal the desperate operator beneath. He looked back at Catherine, then at the cabin where Martha stood, with her rifle still trained on the doorway. "This isn't finished." "Yes," Catherine Brennan said quietly. "It is." They watched in tense silence as the three men mounted their horses and rode back into the forest, disappearing among the pines. Catherine didn't lower her rifle until they were completely out of sight. And even then, she sent one of her ranch hands to trail them at a distance, ensuring they actually left the valley. Only when the hoofbeats had faded completely did Martha finally lower her weapon. Her arms were shaking from cold adrenaline and the crushing weight of what had almost happened. Catherine dismounted and approached the cabin slowly, her hands visible, her rifle slung across her back. "Martha Caldwell? I'm Catherine Brennan. I think we need to talk." Martha stepped out of the doorway, and the full reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. The babies were still crying inside, hungry, cold, terrified. She had no food to give them, no way to care for them, no plan beyond the next few minutes. "Mrs. Brennan," Martha said, her voice cracking slightly, "I don't even know what I've gotten myself into. I was tracking an elk. I found this cabin, and inside there were," she gestured helplessly, 14 of them, all twins. Someone left a journal. "Something about an institute that traffics in children." Catherine's expression was grim. "The Berkshire Children's Institute. I've heard of them. They operate primarily in the eastern cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They target unwed mothers, poor families, immigrant communities, convince them to give up babies, especially twins and triplets. Tell them it's adoption, that the children are going to good homes. But they're not," Martha said, understanding dawning. "Some are," Catherine acknowledged. "The pretty ones, the healthy ones, the ones that can pass for high society. But the others, or the twins they keep in reserve as insurance. Those children disappear into workhouses, orphanages, or worse. The Institute makes its real money on the black market. Wealthy families desperate for heirs, people who don't ask questions about paperwork." Martha felt sick. "The woman who wrote the journal, she said she and someone named Margaret were protecting them, that they'd run from the Institute. Then she was braver than most," Catherine said. "Most people who work for organizations like that are too afraid to break ranks." She stopped, reading something in Martha's expression. "What happened to her?" "The journal says she went for help 5 days ago. Never came back." Catherine's jaw tightened. "Then she's probably dead. The Institute doesn't tolerate traitors. They would have tracked her down." She looked past Martha into the cabin, where the crying had subsided to exhausted whimpers. "May I?" Martha stepped aside, and Catherine entered. What followed was a sight Martha would never forget. This powerful cattle baroness, this woman who commanded an empire, kneeling beside makeshift cribs and examining each baby with surprising gentleness. She checked for signs of illness, malnutrition, injury, her experienced hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd raised children of her own. "They're in bad shape," Catherine said finally, "but they'll survive if we act quickly. How much food is left?" "Almost nothing. Some cornmeal." "The milk cans are nearly empty," Catherine nodded, then strode to the door and called out to her ranch hands. "Samuel, ride back to the ranch. I need supplies, condensed milk, dried beef, blankets, medical kit. Take the fastest horse and don't spare the animal. Jacob, you stay here with us. Thomas, keep watching the tree line. Those Institute men might circle back." She turned back to Martha. "We need to get these children to proper shelter. My ranch is 8 miles west. We can transport them in—" She paused, calculating. "We'll need to make travois. The babies can't ride in this cold. We'll wrap them in blankets, pile them in pulled sleds. It'll be slow going, but safer than trying to ride with them." Martha stared at this woman who'd appeared like divine intervention and was now calmly orchestrating a rescue operation. "Mrs. Brennan, why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't know these children." Catherine met her eyes, and for the first time Martha saw past the hard exterior to something deeper. Old pain, old losses, old battles fought and barely won. 20 years ago, Catherine said quietly, my daughter gave birth to twins, beautiful boys. She wasn't married. The father had abandoned her. She was 19 years old and terrified of what people would say, what society would do to her. She paused, her jaw working with emotion. A man came to our door, said he was from a charitable organization, said he could arrange a discreet adoption, said both boys would go to a good family together. My daughter was desperate, ashamed, convinced she couldn't raise them alone. I was weak. I was afraid of scandal. So I let him take my grandsons. Martha's breath caught. I never saw them again, Catherine continued, her voice hard now, forged from regret. Never got letters, never got updates. When I finally investigated, I discovered the charitable organization didn't exist. The address was fake. The man was a ghost. My grandsons disappeared into whatever system traffics in stolen children, and I spent 5 years searching for them. I hired investigators, followed leads across 6 states, spent a fortune trying to find them. Did you? Martha whispered. Catherine shook her head. No, they're gone. Vanished into America's vast machinery of exploitation and greed. I failed them. Failed my daughter. She never forgave me. Married a rancher from Wyoming and moved away. I haven't seen her in 12 years. She looked at the babies, her expression fierce. So when I heard rumors that Institute men were operating in Montana, I started paying attention, started asking questions. And when I heard gunfire this morning while riding my property lines, I came to investigate. I won't fail again, Martha. I can't. These children are someone's grandsons, someone's granddaughters, someone's legacy. And they're not going to disappear into the same darkness that swallowed mine. Martha felt tears burning her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. She'd lost Jonathan. Catherine had lost her grandsons and her daughter. Both of them carried holes in their lives that couldn't be filled. But maybe, just maybe, they could keep others from suffering the same fate. What do we do? Martha asked. We save them, Catherine said simply. All 14 of them. And then we make damn sure the Institute never sets foot in Montana territory again. The journey to Catherine Brennan's ranch took 6 brutal hours that felt like 6 days. They fashioned travois from pine branches and rope, creating makeshift sleds that could be pulled behind horses through the snow. The babies were bundled in every available blanket, wrapped so tightly that only their faces showed. 14 tiny beings whose survival depended on speed and luck in equal measure. Martha rode alongside the lead travois, constantly checking the bundles, watching for signs of hypothermia or distress. The twins had finally quieted, exhausted beyond crying. their small bodies conserving what little energy remained. That silence terrified her more than any amount of wailing. It spoke of children who'd learned that protest was futile, that the world was a cold place that didn't respond to their needs. Catherine rode ahead, breaking trail through snow that in places reached the horses' chests. Her ranch hands rotated positions, one scouting forward, one watching their back trail, one helping manage the travois when they hit difficult terrain. They moved with military precision, and Martha realized these weren't just cowboys. These were men who'd served in the Indian Wars, who'd fought in range conflicts, who knew how to protect what mattered. The sun was setting when they finally crested a ridge, and Martha saw the Brennan Ranch spread out in the valley below. It was larger than she'd imagined, a main house built from logs and stone that looked like it could withstand a siege, multiple outbuildings, corrals that could hold hundreds of cattle, and beyond it all, thousands of acres of winter-pale grassland stretching to the mountains. "You built all this yourself?" Martha asked, awe creeping into her voice despite her exhaustion. "My husband started it," Catherine replied, her eyes on the ranch with an expression Martha couldn't quite read. "I finished it after he died, turned it from a dream into an empire. Turns out I'm better at business than he ever was, though he'd never have admitted it while alive." She glanced at Martha. Men always underestimate what women can accomplish when they stop asking permission and start taking action. They descended into the valley as full darkness fell, and the ranch came alive with activity. Catherine had sent a rider ahead, so by the time they arrived, the ranch house was blazing with light and warmth. Women emerged from the bunkhouse, the ranch hands' wives, Martha assumed, ready to help with the children. What followed was controlled chaos. The babies were brought inside, unwrapped carefully, examined for frostbite or injury. The ranch's cook, a formidable German woman named Hilda, had prepared warm milk mixed with a little sugar and cornmeal. Not ideal nutrition, but enough to fill empty bellies and provide immediate energy. Martha worked alongside the other women, feeding twins who were too weak to protest, changing soiled clothes, checking tiny fingers and toes for signs of cold damage. She found herself paired with a younger woman named Sarah, perhaps 25, who handled the babies with surprising competence. "You've done this before," Martha observed as Sarah expertly swaddled one of the twin girls. "I was a nurse in Denver before I married Thomas," Sarah replied, nodding toward one of the ranch hands. "Worked in the foundling hospital for 3 years. Saw hundreds of abandoned babies. Most didn't make it." She looked down at the baby in her arms, her expression softening. "These ones are fighters, though. Look at her. She's taking the milk like she owns it. That's a survivor." As the babies were fed and settled, Catherine gathered everyone in the main house's great room. It was a massive space, with a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, heavy wooden beams crossing the ceiling, and furniture built for durability rather than decoration. A map of Montana Territory dominated one wall, marked with property lines and grazing routes. Martha counted 12 people total, not including the babies. Catherine, herself, 3 ranch hands, 4 wives, and 2 older men who had the weathered look of long-time frontier veterans. "Here's our situation," Catherine began without preamble, her tone shifting to pure business. "We have 14 babies who are legally in limbo. They have no documentation, no birth certificates, no records of parentage. According to the journal Martha found, they were stolen by the Berkshire Children's Institute, which means somewhere back east there are 7 mothers who think their children are dead or adopted into good homes." "Can we find the mothers?" Sarah asked. "Eventually, perhaps," Catherine replied. "But that takes time we don't have. The Institute knows these children are here. They'll be back, probably with fabricated legal documents and corrupt officials who'll claim jurisdiction. We need to establish legal custody before that happens." One of the older men, a grizzled rancher named Walter, spoke up. "How do we establish custody when we don't even know their names, who they belong to?" "We create new identities," Catherine said flatly. "The babies are too young to remember their origins. We give them names, establish them as orphans found in Montana Territory, and file paperwork claiming them as wards in need of homes." Martha felt her stomach clench. That's falsifying records. Yes, Catherine acknowledged without shame. It is. It's also the only way to protect them from being taken back east and sold to the highest bidder. Sometimes the law is a tool for justice, Martha. And sometimes it's an obstacle that needs to be circumvented for the greater good. The room was silent as everyone processed this. Finally, Thomas, Sarah's husband, spoke carefully. Mrs. Brennan, if we're caught falsifying territorial records, that's a serious crime. We could all face charges. I'm aware, Catherine said, which is why I'm not asking any of you to participate. This is my decision, my risk. But I'll need help caring for these children while I navigate the legal aspects. Anyone who wants to leave, no hard feelings. I'll pay you full wages through the end of the month. Nobody moved. Martha watched as glances were exchanged, husband to wife, friend to friend. Silent conversations happening in the space between words. These were people who'd chosen to work for Catherine Brennan, who'd seen how she operated, how she treated those under her protection. Whatever loyalty she'd earned, it was being tested now. Finally, Hilda, the cook, stood up. I stay. My family came to America with nothing. We were promised land, opportunity. What we got was exploitation and poverty until we reached Montana. These babies deserve better than to be merchandise for rich people's vanity. I help. One by one, the others nodded agreement. Even Walter, who'd questioned the legality, shrugged. Hell, I've broken worse laws for worse reasons. At least this time it's for something decent. Catherine's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Thank you. All of you. Now here's what we're going to do. First, the children need names. Martha, you found them. You should have first say. Martha's mind went blank. Names, 14 names. How did you name children who'd been stripped of their original identities? Children who should have names given by their mothers, carrying family histories and hopes for the future. Give them fresh starts, Sarah suggested quietly. Names that mean something good. Names that tell them they're wanted, valued, loved. So they began. One by one, they named the twins, creating identities from hope and intention rather than history. The copper-haired boys became James and Jonathan, Martha's contribution, naming one after her lost husband. The twin girls with matching birthmarks became Grace and Hope. The grey, green-eyed boys became Samuel and Simon. And on it went, until all 7 pairs had names that rang with promise rather than past trauma. Second, Catherine continued once the naming was complete, we need to establish a story. The official version is this. Martha discovered an abandoned cabin containing orphaned children during a winter storm. The children's parents died of fever, leaving them alone. Martha brought them to my ranch for shelter, and we're now seeking to place them in good homes throughout the territory. What about the Institute? One of the ranch hands asked. They know the real story. The Institute has no proof, Catherine countered. No documentation, no witnesses beyond their own people, and their own people won't testify without exposing their entire operation. It becomes their word against ours. And in Montana Territory, my word carries considerable weight. Martha listened to the plan taking shape, feeling like she'd stepped into something far larger than a simple rescue. This wasn't just about saving 14 babies. This was about declaring war on a system that treated children as commodities, about drawing a line in the Montana snow and daring the powerful interests back east to cross it. What about me? Martha asked. I can't care for 14 babies alone on my homestead. I can barely manage my own survival. Catherine turned to her, and Martha saw something calculating in her expression, not cold, but strategic. I've been thinking about that. My ranch is successful, but it's also isolated. I have resources but no legitimate heirs. My daughter won't speak to me, remember. What I need is a partner, someone I can trust to help manage not just this situation, but the future I'm planning. What future? Martha asked cautiously. Catherine walked to the map on the wall, running her finger along the property lines. I own 40,000 acres. I employ 30 people. I ship cattle to Denver, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco. But what I don't have is a legacy, something that matters beyond profit and land. She turned back to face the room. I want to build something permanent. A home for children who have nowhere else to go. Not an orphanage, I've seen those, and they're barely better than prisons. I mean a real home. A place where children can grow up with education, opportunity, safety. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Catherine raised her hand for silence. I know it sounds mad, but think about it. We have space, resources, people who know how to work hard and survive in harsh conditions. We could create something unprecedented, a ranch that's also a refuge. Children could learn ranching, agriculture, animal husbandry. The girls could learn business, accounting, management. Everyone would contribute according to their abilities, and everyone would share in the success. You're talking about a commune, Walter said. Not quite disapprovingly, I'm talking about a family, Catherine corrected. An unconventional one, built from necessity and choice rather than blood. And Martha, she looked directly at her, I'm asking you to help me build it. Your homestead borders my property. Sell it to me or merge it into the ranch holdings. Move here. Help me turn this into something that matters. Martha's head spun. 12 hours ago she'd been tracking an elk. Now she was being offered partnership in an empire and custody of 14 babies. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly what Jonathan would have wanted her to do. I need to think, Martha said carefully. It's a lot. Of course, Catherine replied. Take tonight. We'll talk more in the morning. For now, let's focus on keeping these children alive and healthy. As the meeting broke up and people dispersed to their various duties, Sarah pulled Martha aside. She means it, you know. Mrs. Brennan doesn't make offers lightly. If she's asking you to be her partner, it's because she sees something in you. Strength, integrity, the kind of qualities she values. I'm just a widow trying to survive, Martha protested. No, Sarah said firmly. You're a woman who found 14 dying babies and chose to fight armed men rather than walk away. That's not just survival, Martha. That's courage. That's exactly what this place needs. That night, Martha sat in a guest room with 2 of the twin girls sleeping in a crib beside her bed. Grace and Hope, the names she'd helped choose. They looked peaceful now, their tiny chests rising and falling with steady breaths. Their faces relaxed in genuine sleep rather than exhausted unconsciousness. She thought about Jonathan, about the dreams they'd shared for their homestead. They'd wanted children of their own, but that blessing had never come. He died before they could adopt, before they could expand their small family beyond just the 2 of them. Maybe this was the answer. Not the family they'd planned, but the family they were meant to have. 14 children who needed everything: protection, education, love, opportunity, and a partnership with a woman who had the resources and determination to make it happen. Through the window, Martha could see the vast expanse of the Brennan Ranch stretching toward mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. It was beautiful and harsh, promising and dangerous, everything Montana represented. Somewhere out there, the Institute was regrouping, planning their next move. Benjamin Thatcher wouldn't give up easily, not with the financial stakes involved. This wasn't over. The real fight hadn't even begun. But for the first time since Jonathan died, Martha felt something stir in her chest that wasn't just survival instinct or grim determination. It was hope. The possibility that she could build something meaningful from the ruins of her old life. That these 14 babies could become something more than victims or statistics. That together, against all odds, they could create a family that mattered. She reached over and gently adjusted Hope's blanket, tucking it more securely around the sleeping baby. I'll keep you safe, she whispered. All of you, whatever it takes. It was a promise she had no idea how to keep. But it was a promise she meant with every fiber of her being, and in the morning she would give Catherine Brennan her answer. Martha woke to the sound of organized chaos. Through her window, the ranch yard bustled with activity despite the early hour. Ranch hands tending livestock, smoke rising from the cookhouse, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The Brennan Ranch didn't sleep late, even with 14 unexpected guests requiring constant attention. Grace and Hope were already awake. watching her with those solemn eyes that seemed far too knowing for babies, barely old enough to walk. Martha changed them, marveling at how quickly she'd adapted to this new reality. 2 days ago, she'd never held an infant. Now she moved through the motions with growing confidence, born of necessity. She found Catherine in the main house's office, surrounded by papers and ledgers. The older woman looked like she hadn't slept, but her eyes were sharp and focused as she reviewed documents spread across a massive oak desk. Legal paperwork, Catherine explained without looking up. I'm filing emergency custody petitions with the territorial court in Helena. The story is airtight. Abandoned children discovered by a local homesteader, taken in by a responsible rancher with means to care for them. I'm also preparing affidavits from everyone present at the rescue, establishing a clear timeline that omits certain inconvenient details about the Institute. Martha closed the door behind her. I've made my decision. Catherine finally looked up, her expression carefully neutral. And I'll sell you my homestead, Martha said. Fair market value, no charity. And I'll accept your partnership offer, but on one condition. These children aren't just your project. They're ours. Every decision, every risk, every triumph and failure, we share equally. I won't be an employee or a subordinate. If we're building something unprecedented, we build it as equals. A slow smile crossed Catherine's face, the first genuine one Martha had seen from her. Jonathan told me once that you were the real strength in your marriage. He said you had a spine of steel wrapped in kindness. I see he wasn't exaggerating. She stood and extended her hand across the desk. Equal partners, then. 50-50 on all decisions regarding the children and this new venture. Though I retain sole ownership of the ranch's cattle operations, that's my life's work, and I won't dilute it. Fair enough, Martha agreed, shaking her hand. The grip was firm, businesslike, sealing a compact that would reshape both their lives. What do we do first? We establish routines, Catherine replied, already shifting into planning mode. 14 babies require structure, feeding schedules, sleep patterns, medical monitoring. Sarah has nursing experience, so she'll oversee health matters. Hilda manages meal preparation. We need to hire additional help. Women from the surrounding homesteads who need work and can be trusted to keep quiet about the children's origins. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching. The east bunkhouse can be converted into a nursery. It's large enough to accommodate 14 cribs with room for caretakers to sleep nearby. We'll need supplies, cloth for diapers, milk, medical provisions, baby clothes. I'm sending riders to 3 different towns to purchase what we need. Spreading the purchases across multiple locations prevents anyone from asking too many questions about why we suddenly need supplies for 14 infants. Martha watched this woman work, impressed by the meticulous attention to detail. Catherine Brennan wasn't just wealthy. She was strategically brilliant, thinking 3 moves ahead like a chess master. What about education? Martha asked. If we're serious about building a real home, rather than just warehousing children until they're old enough to work, they'll need schooling. I've thought about that, Catherine acknowledged. We'll need a schoolhouse eventually, but these babies won't need formal education for several years. In the meantime, we focus on keeping them alive, healthy, and establishing legal protections that the Institute can't penetrate. A knock on the door interrupted them. Walter entered, his weathered face grim. Mrs. Brennan, we've got a problem. Ryder just came in from town. There's a federal marshal asking questions about missing children. Someone tipped him off that you might be harboring orphans without proper authority. Martha's stomach dropped. The Institute works fast. Faster than I expected, Catherine admitted. She stood, her demeanor shifting from planner to warrior. Where's this marshal now? Still in town, from what the rider says. He's staying at the boarding house, interviewing locals, asking about recent unusual activity, large purchases of baby supplies, anything suspicious. Catherine moved to the window, looking out at her empire with an expression Martha couldn't quite read. A federal marshal has legitimate authority we can't simply dismiss. If he's thorough, he'll find inconsistencies in our story. If he's corrupt, the Institute might have already bought him. So what do we do? Martha asked, fighting rising panic. We get ahead of it, Catherine decided. Walter saddled 2 horses. Martha and I are riding into town. If this marshal wants to investigate, he can do it with full transparency. We invite him to the ranch, show him the children, present our custody petitions, and dare him to find fault with our rescue operation. That's risky, Walter warned. What if he sides with the Institute? Then we fight him legally, publicly and loudly, Catherine replied. The one thing the Institute can't survive is scrutiny. They operate in shadows, using legal gray areas and corrupt officials. We bring everything into the light: newspapers, territorial government, public opinion. We make this a story about Montana, protecting children from East Coast exploitation. We turn it political. Martha admired the audacity, even as fear churned in her gut. You're gambling that public sentiment will protect us. I'm gambling that people will side with babies over bureaucrats, Catherine corrected. It's not much of a gamble. Frontier communities understand survival, family, taking care of your own. A story about rescuing abandoned children plays very differently than a story about stealing Institute property. An hour later, Martha found herself riding toward the town of Willow Creek alongside Catherine. The settlement was small, maybe 300 people, built around a crossroads that connected mining camps to the north with cattle ranches to the south. It boasted a general store, saloon, boarding house, church, and the essential infrastructure of frontier civilization. They found the federal marshal in the boarding house dining room, finishing breakfast. He was younger than Martha expected, maybe 40, with the careful eyes of a man trained to notice details. His badge was real. She could tell from the way people in the room gave him subtle deference. "Marshal," Catherine announced, walking directly to his table with the confidence of someone who owned half the valley. "I'm Catherine Brennan. I understand you're asking questions about children. I can answer them. Would you care to visit my ranch and see the situation firsthand?" The marshal looked up from his eggs, studying her with professional assessment. "Mrs. Brennan, your reputation precedes you. I'm Marshal David Hayes, operating under orders from the territorial governor to investigate reports of child trafficking in this region." "Trafficking?" Martha couldn't help the outrage in her voice. "We rescued those children from certain death." Hayes's gaze shifted to her, sharp and evaluating. "And you are?" "Martha Caldwell. I found the babies in an abandoned cabin 2 days ago. They were starving, freezing, left to die by whoever had them. I brought them to Mrs. Brennan's ranch because it was the closest place with resources to keep them alive." "How many children?" Hayes asked, pulling out a small notebook. 14, Catherine said firmly. 7 sets of twins, all under 2 years old. I've filed emergency custody petitions with the territorial court. Everything is documented and legal." Hayes wrote something in his notebook. 14 babies in one location. That's unusual. Did you find any identification? Birth certificates? Documentation of parentage? There was a journal, Martha said, written by a woman who said she was protecting them from something called the Berkshire Children's Institute. She wrote about running, hiding, keeping them safe from men who were tracking them. Hayes's expression shifted slightly, recognition, or perhaps confirmation of something he already suspected. The Berkshire Institute. I've heard of them. They've been flagged by federal authorities for questionable practices. But they also have powerful connections. Senators, judges, wealthy patrons. So you're here to take the children back to them, Catherine said flatly. I'm here to investigate, Hayes corrected. Which means I need to see these children, verify their condition, and determine whether they're in danger or being properly cared for. Catherine nodded. Then come to the ranch. See for yourself. I have nothing to hide. The ride back took 2 hours. Hayes rode between them, asking careful questions about the discovery, the cabin's location, the children's condition. Martha answered honestly, omitting only the confrontation with Benjamin Thatcher and the Institute's hired men. That detail could complicate things in ways she didn't fully understand. When they arrived at the ranch, Hayes's professional demeanor cracked slightly at the scale of the operation. This wasn't some marginal homestead. This was a legitimate business empire, complete with dozens of employees and infrastructure that suggested wealth and stability. Catherine led him directly to the converted bunkhouse, now transformed into a nursery. 14 cribs lined the walls, each containing a baby being tended by one of the ranch women. The space was warm, clean, organized, a stark contrast to the freezing, desperate cabin where Martha had found them. Hayes walked slowly between the cribs, observing. Sarah was there, checking one of the twin boys for fever. Hilda supervised feeding rotations. Everything spoke of competence, care, and resources. They were all near death when you found them, Hayes asked Martha. Hypothermic, malnourished, dehydrated, Martha confirmed. Another few hours, and they wouldn't have survived. Hayes watched as Sarah gently examined the baby, her practiced hands checking for problems with the efficiency of trained medical personnel. You have a nurse on staff? Sarah worked in a Denver foundling hospital before marrying one of my ranch hands, Catherine explained. She knows infant care better than any doctor within 50 miles. The marshal completed his inspection in silence, then asked to see the journal Martha had mentioned. She retrieved it from Catherine's office, watching nervously as he read the desperate entries written by the unnamed woman who'd tried to save these children. When he finished, Hayes closed the journal carefully. This mentions the Institute by name. It describes running from them, hiding the children, fear of what would happen if they were caught. Yes, Catherine said simply, you understand that if the Institute has legal documentation claiming these children, purchase contracts, custody agreements, whatever paperwork they use, you could be charged with kidnapping. I understand that the Institute traffics in stolen babies, Catherine replied, her voice hard. I understand that somewhere 7 mothers think their children are dead or safely adopted. I understand that these babies were being transported like livestock for sale to the highest bidder. What I don't understand, Marshal, is why the federal government would protect an organization that preys on vulnerable families. Hayes met her stare without flinching. The federal government isn't protecting anyone, but I have to work within the law, Mrs. Brennan. My personal feelings don't matter. If the Institute presents legitimate legal claims, then we fight those claims in court, Catherine interrupted, with lawyers, witnesses, evidence. In the meantime, these children stay here, where they're safe, healthy, and cared for. Unless you're prepared to forcibly remove 14 babies from a warm nursery and transport them back east to an organization under federal investigation for trafficking. The challenge hung in the air. Martha held her breath, watching Hayes's internal struggle play across his face. He was a lawman, bound by regulations and jurisdiction. But he was also, she sensed, a decent man, confronted with a situation where the law and morality weren't perfectly aligned. I need to send a report to the territorial governor, Hayes said finally. I'll document what I've seen here. The children's condition, your custody arrangements, the evidence suggesting they were abandoned or stolen. I'll also include the journal entries referencing the Institute's activities. And, Catherine pressed, and I'll recommend that until the matter is resolved through proper legal channels, the children remain in your custody under territorial supervision. Which means I'll be checking in regularly, monthly inspections to ensure they're being properly cared for. Any sign of neglect, abuse, or improper treatment, and I remove them immediately. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than Martha had dared hope for. Thank you, Marshal, Hayes shook his head. Don't thank me yet. The Institute won't give up easily. They'll bring lawyers, pressure, political influence. This situation is far from resolved. Let them come, Catherine said with quiet confidence. Montana takes care of its own. These children are ours now. And we don't surrender what's ours without a fight. After Hayes departed with his report and promises of monthly inspections, Martha found herself back in the nursery, holding Grace while Hope slept peacefully nearby. The baby had gained weight in just 2 days, her color improving, her eyes more alert. Sarah sat beside her, bottle-feeding one of the twin boys. You did it, she said quietly. Convinced a federal marshal to side with us. That's no small feat. Catherine did it, Martha corrected. She knew exactly how to present the situation, how to appeal to his sense of justice while making it clear that taking the children would be political suicide. You're learning, Sarah observed with a slight smile. Catherine's greatest skill isn't ranching or business. It's understanding power, how to leverage it, when to use it, when to withhold it. You'll need that skill too, if you're going to be her partner in this venture. Martha looked down at Grace. This tiny human who'd been reduced to merchandise by people who saw children as profit centers. I never wanted power. I just wanted a simple life with Jonathan. A homestead, maybe a family. Quiet survival. Life rarely gives us what we want, Sarah said. But sometimes, if we're lucky, it gives us what we need. These children need you, Martha. Not who you were, but who you're becoming. Someone strong enough to protect them from forces most people can't even imagine fighting. Through the window, Martha could see Catherine conferring with Walter and the other ranch hands, already planning the next phase of their defense. This woman who'd lost her grandsons and built an empire from grief and determination. This unlikely ally who'd appeared at the exact moment Martha needed her most. Do you think we can actually do this? Martha asked. Build something that lasts. Create a home that protects children from the systems that exploit them. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. I think Catherine Brennan doesn't fail at things she commits to, and I think you're stronger than you realize. Together? She shrugged. I've seen impossible things happen on this frontier. I've seen people survive winters that should have killed them, build lives from nothing, create communities where only wilderness existed. If anyone can turn 14 abandoned babies into a family, into something unprecedented, it's you two. That night, as Martha lay in bed, listening to the twins' steady breathing, she thought about the journey ahead. The legal battles with the Institute, the challenge of raising 14 children who'd need everything: education, opportunity, love, guidance. The risk of building something so unconventional that society itself might turn against them. But she also thought about Jonathan's voice, the way he used to talk about legacy. Life's not about how much land you own or how much money you make, he'd said once, watching the sunset from their small homestead. It's about what you leave behind that matters, what you build that outlasts you. She'd thought they'd build it together. Instead, she was building it with a cattle baroness, a collection of ranch hands and their wives, and 14 babies who represented every broken promise and stolen dream the frontier had ever witnessed. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but maybe, just maybe, it was the life she was meant to live. Grace stirred in her sleep, making a small sound of contentment. Martha reached over and gently touched the baby's hand, feeling tiny fingers instinctively curl around her own. We'll build you an empire, she whispered. Not of land or money, but of joy, of possibility, of everything you deserve. It was a promise that would take years to fulfill. But Martha Caldwell had learned something important in the past 2 days. She was capable of far more than she'd ever imagined. And with Catherine Brennan as her partner, there was no limit to what they could create. 3 weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and carefully constructed routines. The 14 babies settled into the rhythm of ranch life with remarkable resilience. They gained weight, their hollow cheeks filling out as regular feedings restored what starvation had stolen. The terrible silence that had marked them in the cabin gradually broke, first with tentative coos, then with actual laughter. When Sarah played peekaboo during feeding times, Martha discovered she had a talent for organization she'd never known existed. She created rotation schedules for the women helping with childcare, managed supply inventories, and coordinated with Catherine on everything from diaper washing protocols to long-term planning for sleeping arrangements as the babies grew. The work was exhausting, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways her solitary homesteading had never been. Catherine, meanwhile, focused on the legal and political battlefront. She'd hired a lawyer from Helena, a sharp-minded woman named Rebecca Thornton, who specialized in custody law and had a reputation for taking cases other attorneys considered unwinnable. Together, they built a fortress of documentation. Affidavits from everyone present at the rescue, medical reports from Sarah detailing the children's condition when found, statements from townspeople confirming Martha's character, and territorial custody petitions that painted the situation as humanitarian rescue rather than legal ambiguity. Marshal Hayes made his first inspection visit. Arriving unannounced on a cold March morning, he spent 4 hours at the ranch, examining the nursery, reviewing records, interviewing staff. Martha watched him interact with the babies, noting how his professional detachment softened when little Simon grabbed his finger and refused to let go. "They're thriving," Hayes admitted as he prepared to leave. "Better than most children I've seen in institutional care. But you should know, the Institute has filed a counter-petition with the territorial court. They're claiming the children were legally in their custody when they were taken, and they're demanding their return." Catherine's expression hardened. "On what grounds?" "They've produced contract," Hayes explained, pulling out copies of documents from his saddlebag. "Agreements signed by women identified as the children's mothers, surrendering custody to the Berkshire Children's Institute for purposes of adoption placement. They look legitimate on paper, notarized signatures, witness statements, the full legal apparatus." Martha felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "Those mothers probably thought they were signing adoption papers. They had no idea their babies would be trafficked." "Probably," Hayes agreed. "But proving fraud in those contracts will be difficult. The Institute has lawyers who know how to construct documents that can withstand legal scrutiny. And they have something else." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "They've brought in political pressure. A senator from Massachusetts has written to the territorial governor, describing the Institute as a reputable charitable organization being slandered by frontier vigilantes." Vigilantes. Catherine's voice could have cut glass. "We save children from freezing to death. I'm just telling you what you're up against," Hayes said. "The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from now in Helena. Judge Morrison will preside. He's fair, but he's also bound by law. If the Institute's contracts are legally sound, he may have no choice but to order the children's return." After Hayes departed, Catherine called an emergency meeting. Everyone gathered in the main house: Martha, Rebecca the lawyer, Sarah, Hilda, Walter, and the core group of ranch hands who'd become invested in the children's fate. "We have 2 weeks to build a case that overcomes legally valid contracts," Rebecca began, her tone grim. "That's nearly impossible under normal circumstances. These mothers signed custody over to the Institute, which gives them legal standing to reclaim the children. What if we find the mothers?" Martha suggested. "If we can get them to testify that they were deceived, that they thought their babies would be adopted by good families, not sold." "We'd need to find them first," Rebecca interrupted. "The Institute isn't going to provide their names or locations. And searching 7 different cities for women who may have used false names or moved since signing those papers. We don't have time." "Then we attack the Institute's credibility," Catherine said. "We expose their business model, document their trafficking operation, make them so radioactive that no judge wants to rule in their favor." Walter spoke up from the back of the room. "How do we do that?" "They're in Boston. We're in Montana. We can't exactly walk into their offices and demand their records." A heavy silence fell. Martha's mind raced, searching for solutions that seemed impossibly out of reach. They needed evidence of the Institute's criminal activities, but gathering that evidence required resources, time, and access they simply didn't have. Then Sarah said quietly, "What if the evidence came to us?" Everyone turned to look at her. She was holding one of the twins, James, Martha thought, though telling the copper-haired boys apart was still challenging. "The woman who wrote the journal," Sarah continued, "the one who tried to save these children, she worked for the Institute. She knew their operations intimately. That's why she ran. What if there are others like her, people who've worked for the Institute, seen what they really do, but are too afraid to speak out. Rebecca leaned forward, interest sparking in her eyes. You're suggesting we find whistleblowers? Former employees willing to testify about the Institute's practices. Exactly, Sarah said. There has to be someone. The Institute operates in multiple cities, employs dozens of people. Not all of them can be comfortable with trafficking babies. Some must have consciences. Catherine stood abruptly, moving to her desk, where she kept correspondence from her years of searching for her grandsons. She pulled out a thick folder, its contents worn from repeated handling. I have names, she said slowly, from my investigation 5 years ago. People who worked in the adoption industry, who knew about organizations like the Institute. Some refused to talk to me, but a few. She flipped through papers, her finger stopping on a particular letter. A woman in Philadelphia, Mary Hutchins. She worked for a placement agency that the Institute contracted with. She told me things off the record, said she couldn't testify because she feared for her safety. But maybe now, with a legal subpoena protecting her, it's a long shot, Rebecca warned. Getting someone from Philadelphia to Montana Territory for a hearing in 2 weeks is logistically challenging. And if she's afraid of the Institute, she may refuse regardless of legal protection. Then we make it worth her while, Catherine said bluntly. We offer her sanctuary, a job here on the ranch, protection from the Institute's reach. Whatever it takes to get her testimony. Martha watched this woman work, marveling at how quickly Catherine pivoted from obstacle to solution. What do you need from me? Money, Catherine said without hesitation. A lot of it. Telegrams, travel expenses, legal fees, bribes if necessary. This fight is going to cost more than both our properties combined are worth. Then spend it, Martha replied. What good is land if we lose the children we're trying to protect? The next 2 weeks became a whirlwind of desperate activity. Catherine sent telegrams to Philadelphia, Boston, New York, anywhere her investigation had uncovered potential witnesses. She offered money, protection, transportation. Most didn't respond. A few refused outright, their fear of the Institute's reach overriding any moral compulsion to help. But 3 days before the hearing, a telegram arrived that changed everything. Mary Hutchins agrees to testify. Stop arriving, Helena March. 20. Stop requires protection and relocation. Assistance. Stop bringing documents. Stop documents, Rebecca repeated, reading the telegram over Catherine's shoulder. She's bringing evidence. That's more than testimony. That's documentation of the Institute's operations. The day before the hearing, Martha and Catherine made the 3-day journey to Helena with 6 of their most trusted ranch hands. They brought the babies, all 14 of them, because Rebecca insisted the judge needed to see them, needed to understand these weren't abstract legal entities, but actual children whose lives hung in the balance. The journey was brutal. The babies cried, needed constant feeding and changing, made the already difficult trip exponentially harder. But Martha refused to leave them behind. If they were going to fight for these children's futures, the children themselves should be present. Helena was the territorial capital, a bustling mining town that had transformed itself into a center of government and commerce. The courthouse dominated the main street, a 3-story brick building that represented law and order in a region still finding its identity. They met Mary Hutchins at the hotel the night before the hearing. She was in her 50s, thin and nervous, with the hunted look of someone who'd been running from something for a long time. But when she opened the leather case she'd brought from Philadelphia, Martha understood why the Institute would want her silenced. Inside were ledgers, dozens of them, detailed records of children processed through the Institute's system, names, dates, payments received, destinations, and notations. Cold clinical notes that read like livestock transactions, twin boys, good health, sold separately to maximize profit. Girl, slight deformity, sent to textile mill for labor placement. Twin girls, reserved for Vanderbilt family acquisition. I kept copies, Mary explained, her voice shaking. For 5 years, I worked in their Philadelphia office, processing paperwork, maintaining records. I told myself it was legitimate adoption work. But then I saw the patterns. Twins always separated unless buyers paid premium rates. Children with minor imperfections sent to labor placements instead of families. Mothers told their babies died when actually they were sold to the highest bidder. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Rebecca asked, though her tone was gentle rather than accusatory. "Because I was afraid," Mary admitted. "The Institute has powerful friends. A clerk who worked in their Boston office tried to expose them 2 years ago. She disappeared. They found her body in the harbor 3 weeks later. Police called it suicide." Her hands trembled. "I'm risking my life being here. But when I heard about Montana, about babies being rescued, about someone finally standing up to them, I couldn't stay silent anymore." The hearing began at 9 o'clock the following morning. Judge Robert Morrison presided, a stern-faced man in his 60s with a reputation for strict interpretation of law. The courtroom was packed. News of the case had spread, drawing not just locals, but reporters from Denver and San Francisco newspapers, eager to cover what they called the baby war of Montana. The Institute's legal team arrived in force. 4 lawyers, all male, all dressed in expensive Eastern suits that screamed wealth and privilege. Benjamin Thatcher sat with them, his cultured face showing no emotion as he watched Martha and Catherine take their seats. The proceedings began with the Institute's lawyers presenting their case. They produced the contracts, 7 documents, each signed by a different woman, each surrendering custody of twin babies to the Berkshire Children's Institute. The signatures were notarized. The paperwork appeared flawless. "Your Honor," the lead Institute lawyer argued, "these children were legally entrusted to our organization by their biological mothers. Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Caldwell, however well-intentioned, have interfered with legal custody arrangements. We request the immediate return of all 14 children to Institute care, plus damages for the disruption to our adoption placement operations." Judge Morrison reviewed the contracts carefully. Martha's heart sank as she watched his expression. He was a man who respected documentation, legal precision. The contracts were exactly the kind of evidence that would sway a judge bound by law rather than emotion. Then Rebecca stood for the defense. "Your Honor, I'd like to call our first witness. Mary Hutchins, former employee of the Berkshire Children's Institute's Philadelphia office." The Institute's lawyers erupted in objections, but Morrison waved them down. "I'll hear the witness." Mary took the stand, visibly terrified but determined. In a voice that grew steadier as she spoke, she described the Institute's operations in devastating detail. The ledgers, the profit margins, the deliberate separation of twins to increase revenue, the falsified death certificates given to mothers, the children sold into labor rather than loving homes. Then Rebecca introduced the ledgers themselves into evidence. Page after page of damning documentation that transformed the Institute from charitable organization into criminal enterprise. The Institute's lawyers fought back viciously. They attacked Mary's credibility, her motives, her mental state. They produced their own witnesses, respectable families who'd adopted through the Institute, glowing testimonials about the organization's work. But then Rebecca called Catherine to the stand. And Catherine Brennan, cattle baroness and grieving grandmother, told her story. She spoke of losing her grandsons to an organization that promised adoption but delivered disappearance. She described 5 years of searching, of following leads that went nowhere, of a system designed to erase children from their family histories. "These 14 babies," Catherine said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom, "represent every child stolen from mothers who trusted the wrong people, every twin separated and sold like livestock, every life reduced to profit margins in a ledger. The Institute didn't care for these children. They abandoned them in a frozen cabin to die because keeping them alive was less profitable than cutting their losses. That's not adoption placement. That's murder by neglect." The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison called for order, his gavel slamming repeatedly. But the damage was done. The story was out. The reporters scribbled frantically, already composing headlines that would make the Berkshire Children's Institute a national scandal. Finally, As the afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, Rebecca played her final card. Your Honor, we have one more witness. Someone who can speak directly to the Institute's intentions regarding these specific children. The courtroom doors opened. A woman entered, elderly, Native American, dressed in a mixture of traditional and Western clothing. She walked slowly to the witness stand, her dignity absolute despite the hostile stares from the Institute's legal team. This is Julia Whitehawk, Rebecca explained. She was traveling near the cabin where Mrs. Caldwell found the children. She has testimony about what she witnessed 3 days before the rescue. Through a translator, Julia described seeing 3 white men at the cabin, hearing babies crying inside, watching as the men argued, then left, closing the door behind them and riding away. Abandoning the children deliberately. Did you try to help the babies? Rebecca asked. Julia nodded slowly. I tried the door. It was barred from outside. I had no tools to break it. I rode to nearest settlement for help, but storm came. Could not return for 2 days. By then, Mrs. Caldwell had already found them. It was the final piece. Proof that the Institute hadn't just neglected the children, they'd intentionally left them to die rather than risk the exposure of retrieving them. Judge Morrison adjourned the hearing for deliberation. Martha sat with Catherine in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by the 14 babies who'd somehow slept through most of the proceedings. Exhausted from travel, we did everything we could, Catherine said quietly. Will it be enough? Martha asked. Catherine looked at the children, these 14 miracles who'd survived abandonment, freezing temperatures, starvation, and an organization that saw them as disposable commodities. It has to be, she replied, because there's no other option. Judge Morrison returned after 2 hours of deliberation. The courtroom, which had thinned during the recess, now packed beyond capacity with spectators who'd heard rumors of an impending decision. Martha held Hope in her arms while Catherine sat beside her, Grace sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. The other 12 babies were scattered among Sarah, Hilda, and the ranch women who'd made the journey to Helena. The judge's face revealed nothing as he settled into his chair and surveyed the courtroom with stern authority. Martha's heart hammered so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. This court has reviewed all evidence. Testimony and legal arguments presented by both parties, Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly, despite the absolute silence that had fallen. The matter before us involves competing claims of custody over 14 minor children, specifically 7 sets of twins, currently in the care of Mrs. Catherine Brennan and Mrs. Martha Caldwell. He paused, adjusting his spectacles. The Berkshire Children's Institute has presented contracts that appear, on their surface, to be legally valid documents, transferring custody from biological mothers to their organization. Under normal circumstances, such documentation would be sufficient to establish legal guardianship. Martha felt her stomach plummet. This was it. They were going to lose. However, Morrison continued, and that single word made her breath catch. This court cannot ignore the substantial evidence presented by the defense regarding the Institute's operational practices. The ledgers introduced by Miss Hutchins, if authentic, and I have no reason to believe they are not, demonstrate a pattern of deception, exploitation, and criminal conduct that fundamentally undermines any claim of legitimate custody. The Institute's lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Thatcher's face had gone pale. Furthermore, the judge went on, the testimony of Mrs. Whitehawk establishes that the Institute deliberately abandoned these children in conditions virtually certain to result in their deaths. This court cannot, in good conscience, return children to an organization that has demonstrated such callous disregard for their welfare. Morrison's gaze moved to the babies scattered throughout the courtroom. Simon was awake now, watching the judge with those unusual gray-green eyes, utterly silent, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The contracts presented by the Institute may have technical legal validity, Morrison said, but they were obtained through fraudulent representations to vulnerable women. This court finds that such contracts are void due to fraud, misrepresentation, and violation of public policy. The children were not legally in the Institute's custody when rescued by Mrs. Caldwell, because the Institute had already forfeited any legitimate claim through their criminal conduct. Martha felt tears streaming down her face. Catherine's hand found hers, gripping tight. "Therefore," Morrison declared, his voice ringing with finality, "this court awards full custody of all 14 children to Mrs. Catherine Brennan and Mrs. Martha Caldwell, jointly and severally. The Berkshire Children's Institute's petition is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, I'm recommending that the territorial prosecutor investigate the Institute for child trafficking, fraud, and attempted murder by abandonment. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down like a thunderclap. The courtroom erupted. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. The Institute's lawyers immediately began conferring in urgent whispers. But Martha barely registered any of it. She was holding hope, crying into the baby's soft hair, feeling Catherine's arm around her shoulders as they shared this impossible victory. They'd won. Against wealth, power, legal expertise, and political connections, they'd actually won. But the celebration was short-lived. That evening, back at the hotel, Marshal Hayes appeared at their door with a warning. The Institute's lawyers filed an emergency appeal with the Territorial Supreme Court. They're arguing Morrison exceeded his authority, that the contract should have been upheld regardless of operational concerns. Can they overturn the ruling? Rebecca asked, immediately shifting back into lawyer mode. It's unlikely, Hayes admitted, but possible. The Supreme Court might decide that Morrison made findings of fact that should have been left to a jury trial. They could order a new hearing, or even temporarily return custody to the Institute pending appeal. Catherine's expression hardened. How long until the appeal is heard? Weeks, maybe months. The Territorial Supreme Court doesn't move quickly. Hayes looked uncomfortable. But there's something else you should know. After the hearing, I saw Thatcher meeting with 2 men I didn't recognize. They weren't lawyers. They looked like, he hesitated, like the kind of men you hire when legal methods fail. Martha felt ice forming in her veins. You think they're planning something? I think the Institute just suffered a very public, very expensive defeat, Hayes said carefully. Organizations like that don't take humiliation well. And they have resources to pursue extra-legal solutions if they believe the legal system has failed them. Meaning they might try to take the children by force, Catherine stated flatly. Hayes nodded. It's just speculation, but I wanted you aware. Be careful on your return journey. Watch for anyone following you. And when you reach the ranch, consider posting guards. At least until this appeal process plays out and the Institute accepts they've lost. After Hayes left, Martha found herself staring out the hotel window at Helena's lamplit streets, watching shadows and seeing threats in every movement. They'd won in court, but the real battle might just be beginning. We need a plan, Catherine said from behind her. She'd gathered Rebecca, Sarah, Walter, and the senior ranch hands for an emergency strategy session. If the Institute attempts a raid on the ranch, we need to be prepared. Walter, who'd served in the cavalry before settling into ranch work, took charge of the tactical discussion. The ranch is defensible, but only if we have advance warning. We need lookouts posted on the ridgelines, someone watching the main approaches at all times. We should also consider moving the children to a more secure location within the ranch. The main house has stone walls and can be fortified. We also need to consider what happens if they succeed, Rebecca added grimly. If armed men take those children, where would they go? They can't exactly walk them through Helena's train station without being noticed. They'd head east, Walter said, thinking aloud. Probably have wagons waiting somewhere isolated. Move fast before we can organize pursuit or alert authorities. Hit us, grab the children, and disappear into the territory before anyone can respond. Martha listened to them plan defensive measures, discuss fields of fire and fallback positions, and felt surreal disconnect from reality. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a widow hunting elk. Now she was preparing to defend against a paramilitary assault by child traffickers with institutional backing. There's another option, she said quietly, and everyone turned to look at her. We don't wait for them to come to us. We go public, massively public. We invite newspapers, territorial officials, even the governor himself to the ranch. We make it impossible for the Institute to act without witnesses everywhere. Catherine's eyes lit with understanding. We turn the ranch into a spectacle, a demonstration of what's possible when people choose to protect children rather than exploit them. We invite scrutiny instead of hiding from it. That's risky, Rebecca warned. Public attention cuts both ways. If people decide you're some kind of radical feminist commune raising children without proper moral guidance, then we give them a different story, Catherine interrupted. We show them children thriving. We show them a community that works. We make them fall in love with these babies before anyone can paint us as dangerous or deviant. Over the next 3 days, as they prepared for the journey back to the ranch, Catherine orchestrated what could only be described as a media campaign. She invited reporters to document the return journey. She arranged for the territorial governor to visit the ranch in 2 weeks. She gave interviews describing not just the custody battle, but her vision for a permanent home for displaced children, a place where orphans could grow up with education, opportunity, and dignity. The newspapers ate it up. Montana's Mother of Multitudes read one headline. Cattle Queen builds empire of compassion, declared another. By the time they left Helena, Martha and Catherine had become minor celebrities, and the 14 babies had become symbols of frontier justice, triumphing over Eastern corruption. The journey home took 5 days, slowed by the presence of 3 newspaper reporters and a photographer who documented every mile. It was exhausting, having their every action observed and recorded, but Martha understood the strategic value. Every photograph, every article, every human interest story made it harder for the Institute to act with violence. They arrived at the ranch to find it transformed. Walter had organized the ranch hands into a defensive perimeter. Lookouts rotated shifts on the ridge lines. The main house had been reinforced. Shutters on windows, additional bars on doors, stockpiles of supplies in case of siege. But there was also celebration. The entire community turned out to welcome them home, to see the babies who'd become the center of their collective purpose. Hilda had prepared a feast. Someone had strung lanterns across the yard. It felt less like a homecoming and more like a declaration. This place, these people, these children, they mattered. They were worth fighting for. That night, after the babies were settled and the celebration had quieted, Martha stood on the porch of the main house, looking out at the ranch bathed in moonlight. Catherine joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Do you ever regret it?" Martha asked. "Taking this on? You could have just reported what I found to authorities and walked away. Instead, you've made yourself a target." Catherine was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee. "My grandsons are out there somewhere," she finally said. "Maybe in good homes, maybe not. I'll probably never know. But these 14, I can save them. I can give them what my grandsons never got. That's not something to regret, Martha. That's redemption." A sound from the darkness made them both tense. Walter emerged from the shadows, rifle in hand. Riders approaching. 3 of them moving slow. "They're flying a white flag." Martha and Catherine exchanged glances. A white flag meant parley, negotiation. "But it could also be a trap. Wake everyone," Catherine ordered. "Full defensive positions, but hold fire unless they make aggressive moves. I want to hear what they have to say." 10 minutes later, 3 riders sat their horses at the edge of the lamplight's reach. Martha recognized Benjamin Thatcher in the center. The 2 flanking him were strangers, hard-faced men who sat their saddles with military bearing. "Mrs. Brennan," Thatcher called out, "I'm here to make you an offer." "You have nothing I want," Catherine replied coldly. "Don't I?" Thatcher smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "The Institute is prepared to concede the custody battle. We'll withdraw our appeal, acknowledge defeat in court, and leave Montana Territory permanently." "In exchange for what?" Martha asked, not trusting this sudden capitulation. 3 of the children," Thatcher said simply. "Any 3. You choose. The Institute has clients who've already paid substantial sums for twins. We need to deliver something, or we face financial ruin. Give us 3 children, and the other 11 are yours forever. No more legal challenges, no more threats. You get to keep your ranch, your reputation, and most of your precious babies. The offer hung in the night air like poison. Martha felt sick. They were bargaining for children, like they were discussing livestock trades. You're asking us to choose, Catherine said, her voice dangerously quiet. To decide which 3 children are worth less than the others. I'm offering you a practical solution, Thatcher countered. You can't save them all, Mrs. Brennan. That's the harsh reality. But you can save most of them. 11 children raised in safety versus 14 children in constant danger, as the Institute pursues every legal and extra-legal avenue to reclaim them. Which outcome serves your principles better? Martha wanted to shoot him. The casual cruelty, the reduction of human lives to negotiating points, the assumption that they could be bought or intimidated into betraying 3 innocent babies. It made her blood boil with rage she'd never experienced before. No, Catherine said flatly. Thatcher's smile faded. You're making a mistake. The Institute has resources you can't imagine. We can make your lives difficult for years. Legal fees that bankrupt you. Political pressure that destroys your reputation. And if legal methods continue to fail, he let the threat hang unfinished, then you'll discover that Montana women are harder to kill than you expect, Catherine replied. And that we have resources too. Every newspaper west of the Mississippi is watching this ranch. Every territorial official knows your name and your organization's crimes. You make one move against us, and you'll have federal marshals, territorial militia, and public outrage descending on you like the wrath of God. You're bluffing, Thatcher said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Try me, Catherine invited. Attack this ranch, and I promise you'll regret it. Every man you send will face armed defenders who know this terrain and have everything to lose. And even if you somehow succeed, where will you take the children? Every town, every train station, every border crossing will be watching for you. You'll be fugitives carrying stolen babies through territory that wants you dead. Martha watched this confrontation, seeing the calculation happening behind Thatcher's eyes. He was measuring risks against rewards, violence against consequences. The Institute had sent him to make a deal, but they'd also given him authority to assess whether force was viable. She could see him reaching a conclusion, and she could see it wasn't the conclusion they'd hoped for. You'll regret this decision, Thatcher said finally, turning his horse. The Institute doesn't forget debts. Someday, when you're not expecting it, we'll collect what's owed. They rode back into darkness, leaving Martha and Catherine standing in the lamplight, surrounded by armed defenders. That was a declaration of war, Walter observed quietly. No, Catherine corrected. That was a defeated enemy making empty threats to save face. They came here hoping we'd fold under pressure. Instead, they found a community ready to fight. They'll go back to Boston, explain that Montana is too expensive and dangerous to pursue, and find easier targets elsewhere. You sound certain, Martha said. Catherine met her eyes. I've spent 20 years building this ranch in one of the harshest territories in America. I've survived blizzards, droughts, range wars, and economic collapses. The Institute is just another threat to survive. And we will survive it, Martha. Because we have something they don't. What's that? We have a reason to fight that goes beyond money or pride, Catherine said simply. We're protecting children, and there's no force on earth more dangerous than people defending those they love. Inside the house, one of the babies began to cry. James or Jonathan, Martha thought, still learning to tell them apart. Sarah's voice rose in a soothing lullaby. And gradually the crying subsided. Martha looked at the ranch, at the people who'd gathered to defend it, at the light spilling from windows that now sheltered 14 children who'd come within hours of death. They'd won in court. They'd survived threats and intimidation. They'd built something unprecedented in the space of a few weeks. But the real work was just beginning. Raising these children, giving them lives worth living, turning this rough collection of people and structures into a genuine home. That would take years, decades maybe, I'm ready, Martha said quietly. For what? Catherine asked. For whatever comes next. The appeals, the threats, the years of work, all of it. These children deserve everything we can give them. So that's what we'll do. Catherine smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed her stern features. Then let's get started, partner. We have an empire of joy to build. Spring arrived in Montana with the subtlety of an explosion. Snow melted in torrents, transforming creeks into raging rivers and turning the ranch's careful pathways into mud trenches that sucked at boots and wagon wheels. But with the thaw came possibility, the chance to build, expand, and transform Catherine's vision from desperate rescue into permanent reality. The 14 babies were growing at astonishing rates. At 4 months under proper care, they'd transformed from hollow-eyed survivors into thriving infants with personalities emerging like flowers after winter. James was bold, always reaching for things beyond his grasp. Jonathan was contemplative, watching everything with serious attention. Grace had discovered her voice and used it with enthusiastic frequency. Hope, her twin, remained quieter but observed everything, with intense focus that suggested she was cataloguing the world. For future reference, Martha found herself falling in love with each of them in different ways, their distinct temperaments. The way Samuel always smiled when Sarah sang to him. How Simon would only settle for sleep if someone was walking him in circles around the nursery. They weren't abstract responsibilities anymore. They were hers, theirs, family in the truest sense, but love wasn't enough. These children needed futures. Catherine called a planning meeting on the first truly warm day of spring. She'd invited not just the ranch corps, but also people from the surrounding community, school teachers from Willow Creek, a minister from the Lutheran Church, a doctor who'd recently established practice in Helena, and surprisingly, Governor Wallace himself, who'd made good on his promise to visit. They gathered in the ranch's largest barn, which had been cleaned and outfitted with borrowed chairs and tables. Martha stood beside Catherine at the front, feeling uncharacteristically nervous about addressing this assembly of influential people. "Thank you all for coming," Catherine began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "You're here because you've expressed interest in what we're building at this ranch. Not just a rescue operation, but something permanent. Something that could change how Montana, how America, thinks about caring for displaced children." She unveiled a large diagram that had been covered with canvas. It showed the ranch, but transformed. A new building labeled Schoolhouse occupied a prominent position. Another structure marked Medical Clinic sat near the main house. Expanded dormitories, a workshop building, even a small chapel. "This is the vision," Catherine continued. "A self-sustaining community built around the principle that every child deserves education, opportunity, and dignity, regardless of their origins. Children who come here won't just be warehoused until adulthood. They'll be taught practical skills, ranching, agriculture, trades, but also academics, reading, mathematics, science, literature. We'll prepare them to enter society as capable, educated citizens." Governor Wallace studied the diagram with interest. "This is ambitious, Mrs. Brennan. You're essentially proposing to create a private school combined with a working ranch, an orphanage, and a vocational training center. The cost alone would be staggering." "I'm prepared to fund the initial construction," Catherine replied. "But long-term sustainability requires more than my personal wealth. Which is why I'm proposing a partnership with the territorial government. You provide teaching licenses, medical oversight, and legal recognition of our educational credentials. In return, we accept any child the territory places with us, train them at no cost to taxpayers, and produce productive citizens rather than criminals or charity cases." Martha watched the governor's expression shift from skepticism to genuine consideration. Catherine was offering him something politically valuable, a solution to the territory's growing problem of abandoned and orphaned children, without burdening the territorial budget. "What about moral oversight?" the minister asked, a thin man named Reverend Carlson, who'd been watching the proceedings with pursed-lipped disapproval. Who ensures these children are raised with proper Christian values? That they're not exposed to unconventional influences? The question hung heavy with implication. Martha understood immediately what he wasn't saying. Concern about two unmarried women raising children without male authority, about a ranch that operated outside traditional family structures, about the kind of independence that made some people uncomfortable. Catherine's expression hardened. The children will receive religious education in accordance with their family's wishes, once we can determine what those wishes would have been. We'll have visiting clergy from various denominations. But this won't be a religious institution, Reverend. It'll be a working ranch that happens to house children. The same moral values that govern any frontier community will govern here. Hard work, honesty, mutual support. What about when they're older? Asked Mrs. Peterson, one of the school teachers. You have 7 boys and 7 girls now. When they reach adolescence, how do you manage the complications of teenagers living in close proximity? The same way every farming family in America manages it, Martha spoke up, finding her voice. With supervision, clear expectations, and trust that proper upbringing produces decent people. These children will work alongside us daily. They'll be too exhausted from honest labor to cause much trouble. And as they grow, we'll expand facilities to ensure appropriate separation of sleeping quarters. Dr. Harrison, the Helena physician, raised a practical question. What about medical care? 14 children will face illnesses, injuries, childhood diseases. You can't rely on Sarah's nursing skills alone, capable as she is. Which is why we're building a clinic, Catherine replied. We're prepared to pay a competitive salary for a resident physician willing to relocate to the ranch. Someone who understands that frontier medicine requires improvisation and doesn't demand the amenities of city practice. The discussion continued for 3 hours, covering everything from curriculum development to livestock management to legal structures for property inheritance. Martha found herself impressed by Catherine's preparation. She'd anticipated nearly every objection, every logistical concern, every political complication. Finally, Governor Wallace stood. Mrs. Brennan, Mrs. Caldwell, what you're proposing is unprecedented in Montana territory, possibly in the entire West. But I've seen the children. I've read the reports. And I've watched how this community has rallied around them. He paused, measuring his words. I can't give you official territorial endorsement without legislative approval. But I can provide provisional recognition. If you build this school, meet basic educational standards, and maintain proper medical and safety protocols, I'll recommend the legislature grant you formal charter status. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Approval, tentative, conditional, but real. Construction began the following week. Catherine hired crews from Helena and Butte, carpenters, stonemasons, laborers who needed work and didn't ask too many questions about the unconventional nature of the project. The schoolhouse went up first, a solid structure of pine logs and riverstone that could accommodate 30 students with room to grow. Martha threw herself into the physical work alongside everyone else. She'd spent 2 years maintaining a homestead alone. She knew how to swing a hammer, lift beams, and endure the bone-deep exhaustion of construction labor. Working beside Catherine, Sarah, and even some of the ranch hands' wives who'd insisted on helping, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just building structures. It was building a community bound by shared purpose rather than blood or convention. The babies watched from nearby, their cribs arranged under a canvas awning that protected them from sun and occasional spring rain. They were becoming part of the ranch's daily rhythm, their feeding schedules coordinated with work breaks, their nap times providing blessed quiet during the hottest hours, their laughter and crying becoming the soundtrack of construction. One afternoon, as Martha took a break from helping install window frames, she found Catherine standing alone, looking at the half-finished schoolhouse with an expression Martha had never seen before. It took a moment to identify hope, unguarded and vulnerable. Jonathan would have loved this, Martha said quietly, moving to stand beside her. So would my daughter, Catherine replied, before everything fell apart between us. She used to talk about opening a school someday, teaching children who couldn't afford Eastern academies. She shook her head. I was too focused on the ranch, on building wealth and prestige. I told her teaching was impractical, that she should focus on finding a suitable husband. I pushed her toward convention when she needed support for her dreams. It's not too late, Martha ventured. Once this is established, once we're successful, maybe she'd come back. See what you've built in honor of the grandsons you lost. Catherine's jaw tightened. Maybe, or maybe some wounds don't heal. But at least I'll know I did something good with the second chance these children represent. As summer arrived, the ranch transformed before their eyes. The schoolhouse stood complete, its interior outfitted with desks built by Walter and the other ranch hands. The medical clinic took shape, smaller than the school, but equipped with supplies Dr. Harrison had helped procure. Dormitory expansions added separate wings for boys and girls, designed for future growth as the children aged. But the most significant development was human rather than architectural. Word had spread about what Catherine and Martha were building. Letters began arriving from across the territory, from women who'd lost husbands and couldn't support their children alone, from frontier towns with orphans and no resources to care for them, from desperate people seeking solutions to impossible situations. We can't take everyone, Catherine said, reviewing the 20th such letter in as many days. This one was from a widow in Wyoming with 4 children and a failing homestead. We're already at capacity with the 14. We don't have space, supplies, or staffing for more. Then we expand, Martha replied, an idea crystallizing. We don't turn this into just a home for our 14. We make it a model that can be replicated. Other ranches, other communities, they see what's possible here and build their own versions. Catherine looked up sharply. You're talking about a movement. I'm talking about changing the system, Martha said, surprised by her own boldness. The Institute thrives because society has no good options for displaced children. Orphanages are nightmares. Workhouses are barely better than prisons. But this, she gestured at the ranch, at everything they'd built, this shows there's another way. Children can be assets to a working operation rather than burdens. Education and labor aren't mutually exclusive. You can build something economically sustainable that also treats children like human beings rather than problems to be managed. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, then smiled slowly. You've changed since that day in the cabin. The widow hunting elk has become a revolutionary. The widow hunting elk found a purpose worth fighting for, Martha corrected. These children gave me that. You gave me that. Now we give it to others. They began documenting everything. Sarah kept detailed health records, showing the children's development from near death to thriving. Martha maintained educational plans and schedules. Catherine tracked financial data proving the ranch's economic viability, with child labor integrated into operations. They were building not just a home, but a blueprint. The governor made his second visit in July, bringing 2 territorial legislators with him. They toured the completed facilities, interviewed staff, and observed the children, now sitting up, some beginning to crawl, all clearly healthy and well cared for. This is remarkable, one legislator admitted. A practical-minded rancher named Douglas, who'd initially opposed the whole endeavor as feminine sentimentality. I expected charity work. Instead, I'm seeing a functioning economic model that happens to include child welfare. Because children aren't charity cases when integrated into productive work, Catherine explained. They're future laborers, future neighbors, future citizens. Investing in them is investing in Montana's future. Douglas nodded slowly. I'll support your charter application when it comes before the legislature. But I want quarterly reports. Proof this isn't just an expensive experiment that'll collapse once the novelty wears off. You'll have them, Catherine promised. As the legislators departed, Martha overheard one say to the other, "Those women are either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. Does it matter?" The other replied, "If this works, they've solved a problem no one else even tried to address." That's worth supporting, even if they are unconventional. Unconventional. The word that kept appearing in every assessment of what they'd built. Martha had stopped seeing it as criticism. Conventional had meant children dying in frozen cabins. Conventional had meant the institute trafficking babies like commodities. If unconventional meant children laughing while learning to crawl on a Montana ranch, then unconventional was something to be proud of. That evening, after the children were settled and the day's work completed, Martha found herself on the porch of the main house with Catherine, Sarah, and Hilda. They'd fallen into this routine, the four women who formed the operational core of everything they'd built, sharing a quiet hour before bed to review the day and plan tomorrow. "We received 3 more letters today," Sarah reported. 2 from widows seeking placement for children. 1 from a town council asking if we'd consider taking a pair of orphaned siblings. "How old are the siblings?" Catherine asked. 5 and 7. "Their parents died of cholera." Martha watched Catherine's face as she processed this. The 14 babies had been one thing. Infants who wouldn't remember their trauma, who could be shaped from near-blank slates. But older children came with memories, established personalities, potential trauma that required different approaches. "We are not equipped for older children yet," Catherine said carefully. "But we will be. Next year, once the 14 are more independent, once we've hired additional staff. Tell the town council we'll revisit their request in 6 months. "That's progress," Hilda observed in her thick German accent. 6 months ago you say no immediately. Now you say maybe later. "You are becoming soft, Catherine Brennan." Catherine smiled. "Not soft, strategic. Every child we help successfully builds our credibility. But taking on more than we can manage risks failure that would discredit everything we've accomplished. Strategic softness," Sarah suggested. "The most dangerous kind." They laughed together, these 4 women who'd become something none of them had anticipated. Partners in an enterprise that defied easy categorization. Not quite a ranch, not quite an orphanage, not quite a school. Something entirely new, built from necessity and vision in equal measure. Inside the house, one of the babies cried out, "Grace," from the sound. Martha stood automatically, muscle memory taking over. "My turn for night duty," but Catherine stood too. "I'll come with you. I've been reviewing ledgers all day. I need to remember why we're doing this." They entered the nursery together, where Grace had indeed woken, her face scrunched in protest at some infant discomfort. Martha lifted her, checking for obvious problems, wet diaper, hunger, illness. Finding nothing wrong, she simply held the baby, walking slow circles around the room. Catherine stood near Jonathan's crib, watching the sleeping baby boy, named after Martha's lost husband. "Do you think he would have approved?" she asked quietly. "Of all this?" "Jonathan?" Martha considered. "He would have thought we were crazy. Then he would have grabbed a hammer and started building. He believed in doing the work that needed doing, regardless of whether anyone else thought it was possible." "I wish I'd known him better," Catherine said. "I wish my husband could see this too. He always said the ranch was about legacy, building something that would outlast us. But he thought legacy meant land and cattle. I think he'd be surprised to learn it means children and possibility." Grace settled in Martha's arms, her tiny body relaxing against the steady rhythm of being walked. These moments, quiet, ordinary, unremarkable, were the foundation of everything else. All the legal battles, political maneuvering, and construction projects existed to support these simple minutes of a baby being comforted. Learning that the world held people who would respond to her needs. "We're going to change things," Martha said softly. "Not just for these 14, but for children across the territory. Across the country, maybe. People are watching what we build here. And when they see it works, they'll copy it, improve it, make it their own." "That's a bold claim," Catherine observed. "You taught me to think boldly," Martha replied. "You showed me that the impossible only remains impossible until someone refuses to accept that limitation." Catherine moved to stand beside her, looking down at Grace's peaceful face. "Then let's make sure we build something worth copying. Let's make sure that when people look at this ranch decades from now, they see proof that compassion and practicality aren't opposites. That you can build an empire from kindness, An empire of joy, Martha thought, remembering Catherine's words from months ago. That's what they were building, not through conquest or exploitation, but through the radical act of believing that children deserve better than what society offered them. Outside, summer night sounds drifted through the open windows. Crickets, distant cattle lowing, the soft murmur of ranch hands finishing evening chores. The same sounds that had filled Montana nights for generations. But now they were the soundtrack to something unprecedented. 14 babies sleeping peacefully in a nursery that shouldn't exist, cared for by a community that refused to accept conventional limitations, protected by 2 women who'd found purpose in each other's strength. The empire of joy was no longer just a dream. It was becoming real, one day at a time. 5 years later, spring 1894, the schoolhouse bell rang across the Brennan-Caldwell Ranch, its clear tones summoning children from morning chores. Martha stood on the porch, watching 19 children respond to that familiar sound. The original 14 were now nearly 7 years old, walking, talking, reading, living with unself-conscious energy that defined childhood at its best. James and Jonathan raced toward the schoolhouse, copper hair catching sunlight. Grace walked arm in arm with Hope, discussing something with serious intensity. But there were others now too. Anna, 9 years old, helping younger children navigate the steps. Michael and Thomas, brothers orphaned by a mining accident, now thriving where they'd once been feral. 5 years of impossible work had created something no longer impossible. Sarah emerged from the clinic, joining Martha on the porch. Everyone healthy except Michael, faking a cough to avoid arithmetic. I told him he'd need better acting skills to fool me. Martha laughed, but it died when she saw Marshall Hayes riding up the path, his expression troubled. News from back east, Hayes said after dismounting. The Berkshire Children's Institute has collapsed. Federal investigation caught up with them. Benjamin Thatcher faces trial in Boston. They're estimating over 300 children were trafficked through their system. Martha's breath caught. 300. The prosecutor wants to reunite children with biological families where possible. Hayes pulled out a telegram. The Institute's records include entries for 7 sets of twins, matching your 14. They believe they can identify the mothers. The implication crashed over Martha like a wave. After 5 years, these children don't remember their mothers. This is their only home. If biological parents can be located and want their children returned, courts might rule in their favor, Hayes said gently. You have custody based on rescue and abandonment. But if mothers prove they were deceived, then we lose them, Martha finished hollowly. Before Hayes could respond, Catherine's wagon appeared on the horizon, returning from Helena earlier than expected. She took one look at their faces and knew something had changed. After Hayes explained, Catherine stood silent for a long moment, staring at the schoolhouse where children's voices drifted through open windows. We always knew this was possible, she said finally, that someday someone might come looking. But I'd hoped, her voice cracked slightly, I'd hoped we'd have more time. What do we do? Sarah asked. Catherine's expression hardened with determination Martha had seen before. We contact the mothers ourselves, before the prosecutor does. We invite them here, let them see what their children have become, what kind of life they're living, and then we let the mothers decide. That's risky, Hayes warned. You're giving up your only legal advantage. Our advantage was never legal, Catherine replied. It was moral. These children are thriving. Any mother who sees that will have to weigh taking her child back against disrupting a life that's working. We trust that maternal love means wanting what's best for the child, even if that's painful for the parent. Over the next month, letters went out to 7 cities. Catherine hired investigators to locate the women who'd signed those fraudulent contracts 5 years ago. 4 were found quickly. 2 took weeks. 1 had died, leaving behind a husband who'd never known about the twins she'd given birth to. The responses varied. 2 mothers wrote back immediately, desperate to reclaim children they'd believed dead. 1 refused contact, the shame apparently too overwhelming. 3 others agreed to visit the ranch before deciding anything. The first mother arrived in June, Her name was Margaret Chen, originally from San Francisco, who'd given birth to twin boys, James and Jonathan, while unmarried and desperate. The Institute had told her they died during delivery. She'd mourned them for 5 years, only learning the truth when federal investigators appeared at her door with questions about forged death certificates. Martha watched from the schoolhouse window as Margaret stepped down from the stagecoach, her hands trembling as she looked around the ranch. She was younger than Martha expected, maybe 30, with the worn appearance of someone who'd survived through sheer stubborn endurance. Catherine greeted her personally, leading her not to the house, but to the pasture where James and Jonathan were helping Walter repair fence posts. The boys worked with the easy competence of children raised around physical labor, laughing as they competed over who could hammer nails straighter. Margaret stopped walking, one hand pressed to her mouth. From this distance, she couldn't hear what Catherine was telling her, but Martha could imagine, "These are your sons. Healthy, educated, loved. They don't remember you, but they're alive because you gave them life and because we refuse to let that life be wasted." The meeting lasted 3 hours. Martha didn't intrude, but Sarah reported later that Margaret had sat with the boys, watched them work, asked them about their studies and their dreams. James had told her about wanting to be a rancher like Walter. Jonathan had described the book he was reading about astronomy. When Margaret finally emerged from the main house with Catherine, her eyes were red, but her expression was resolute. "They're happy," Margaret said to Martha. "They have a home, education, a future. Taking them back to San Francisco, to my small apartment and factory work." She shook her head. "I wanted my children back. But what I really wanted was to know they were alive and well." "And they are. You're not claiming them?" Martha asked carefully. "I'm acknowledging that sometimes love means letting go," Margaret replied. "But I want letters, pictures, updates about their lives. And when they're older, when they can understand, I want them to know I didn't abandon them by choice. That I was deceived and that finding out they were alive was the greatest gift I've ever received." 2 other mothers made similar decisions after visiting. They saw children thriving in an environment they couldn't replicate, and they chose their children's welfare over their own desire for reunion. But the 4th mother was different. Elizabeth Warren arrived from Boston with her new husband, a lawyer who'd helped her navigate the federal investigation. Her twin girls were Grace and Hope. Unlike Margaret, Elizabeth demanded immediate custody. She had resources now, a stable home, the ability to provide for her daughters. "They're my children," Elizabeth insisted during a tense meeting in Catherine's office. "I was told they died. I grieved them. Now I discover they're alive, and you expect me to just leave them here?" "I expect you to consider what's best for them," Catherine replied firmly. "They're nearly 7 years old. They've never known any home but this ranch. Tearing them away from everything familiar, from their siblings. Elizabeth's voice rose. "These other children aren't their siblings. I'm their mother. That trumps whatever artificial family you've constructed here." The legal battle that followed was brutal. Elizabeth filed for custody in federal court, arguing that the original rescue was now moot since biological family had been located. Rebecca argued that 5 years of established guardianship created bonds that shouldn't be severed without considering the children's welfare. The judge ordered interviews with Grace and Hope, now old enough to express preferences, though not old enough for their opinions to be legally binding. Martha sat with the girls the night before their interview, trying to explain something she barely understood herself. "Tomorrow you'll talk to a judge. He'll ask about a woman named Elizabeth. She gave birth to you. A long time ago, she thought you died, but now she knows you're alive and she wants you to come live with her." Grace and Hope exchanged glances, that twin communication that didn't require words. Finally, Grace spoke. "Will you come with us?" Martha felt her heart break. "If you go, I can't come." "She'd be your family then." Hope's eyes filled with tears. "But you're already our family. You and Aunt Catherine and Sarah and everyone. Why do we have to leave?" "Because sometimes laws are complicated," Martha said helplessly. And sometimes they don't account for love that doesn't fit into traditional categories. The judge ruled in Elizabeth's favor. Blood relation and the documented deception of the Institute outweighed the ranch's custody. Grace and Hope would leave within a week. The day they departed was the hardest of Martha's life, harder even than losing Jonathan. The girls clung to her, crying, begging not to go. Elizabeth stood by her carriage, her expression conflicted but determined. The other 12 children watched in confusion and fear, suddenly understanding that the security they'd known wasn't permanent. As the carriage pulled away, Hope looked back through the rear window, her small hand pressed against the glass. Martha stood frozen until the carriage disappeared, then walked blindly toward the barn, where no one would see her collapse. She found Catherine there, sitting in the hay, tears streaming down her face, the first time Martha had ever seen her cry. "We lost them," Catherine said. "After everything, we lost them." Martha sat beside her, and they grieved together for the children who'd been theirs, briefly, before the world reclaimed them. But life continued. The remaining 12 children needed stability, reassurance that they wouldn't be similarly torn away. Martha and Catherine threw themselves into maintaining routines, proving through actions that the ranch remained a sanctuary, even as its permanence had been revealed as conditional. Letters arrived monthly from Margaret Chen, filled with gratitude and requests for updates about James and Jonathan. The boys read them with polite interest, but didn't ask to visit their biological mother. This was their home. Margaret understood that, and she loved them enough to accept it. Elizabeth sent nothing for 6 months. Then a brief note arrived. "The girls are adjusting. It's difficult. They ask about the ranch constantly. Perhaps when they're older they can visit, perhaps." That single word carried so much uncertainty, so much pain. 10 years later, 1899, the ranch had grown beyond recognition. 43 children now called it home. The original schoolhouse had been expanded twice. 3 more dormitories stood where once there'd been only open pasture. The territorial legislature had granted full educational charter status. Children who graduated from the Brennan-Caldwell School received certificates recognized throughout Montana and beyond. Martha, now 53, watched from the porch as the newest arrivals, siblings from a mining disaster in Butte, tentatively explored their new home. James, now 16, was showing them the stables. Anna supervised younger children at their chores with the natural authority of someone who'd grown up in this system and understood its rhythms. A carriage appeared on the horizon. Visitors weren't unusual anymore. Prospective donors, territorial officials, families inquiring about placement. But something about this carriage made Martha's breath catch. 2 young women stepped out, nearly 17 years old, one with Grace's determined expression, the other with Hope's thoughtful intensity. They'd come home. Elizabeth Warren stepped out behind them, older and more tired-looking than Martha remembered. "They insisted," she said simply. "Every year they asked. Finally, I realized I was keeping them from part of themselves." Grace and Hope ran to Martha, no longer little girls but young women. Yet when they embraced her, Martha felt the years collapse. They were hers again. Not legally, not permanently, but in the ways that mattered. "We want to help," Grace said. "We want to work here, teach or manage operations, or whatever you need. This is where we belong." Catherine appeared from the barn, saw the girls and stopped. For a long moment she just stared. Then she smiled, genuine, warm, transformative. "Welcome home," Catherine said. That night, with Grace and Hope sleeping in their old room, Martha stood on the porch beside Catherine, looking at the empire they'd built from desperation and determination. "We did it," Martha said quietly. "Not perfectly. We lost some battles. But we built something that lasts. Not an empire of land or money," Catherine agreed. "But something better. An empire of possibility, of second chances, of love that doesn't require blood relation to be real." In the distance, children's laughter drifted from the dormitories. The original 12, now young adults, were telling stories to the younger ones, passing down the history of this place they'd helped create. Martha thought about that frozen cabin, the 14 babies who shouldn't have survived. She thought about the impossible journey from that moment of horror to this moment of triumph. Jonathan would have been proud, she said. So would my grandsons, Catherine replied. Wherever they are. They stood together, two women who'd built the impossible through sheer refusal to accept that some lives mattered less than others, who'd proven that family was what you created, not just what you inherited, who'd transformed 14 abandoned babies into 43 thriving children, and in the process, changed what Montana, what America believed was possible. The Empire of Joy stood solid beneath Montana stars, built from love and stubbornness and the absolute certainty that every child deserved a chance to become who they were meant to be. And that empire would endure long after its founders were gone, a testament to what two frontier women had dared to imagine and had the courage to build. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.